The following story is also available as a read-only version. Check the link in the description if you're interested. This story contains themes of fantasy racism and slavery. Summer had come to Cravaille. Comte Herval Simari stood in the necropolis of his family estate, looking up at the statue on his father's grave. His gentle smile was friendly and compassionate, the calming gesture of his arms magnanimous. Still, it failed to encapsulate his greatness. It was much like the tears Herval had shed these past 3 years had failed to encapsulate the sorrow he felt at having lost him. A gentle wind rustled the topiary. The bushes were simple but well kept, as they ought to be in a place of rest. Herval looked down at the town below. Almost 100 buildings were enclosed by several walls, each expanding outward a little further as Cravaille grew over centuries and millennia. On other worlds, Herval's castle would have been considered a mighty citadel, its many ring walls excessive for protecting just a few peasants. But here, on Epurne, the wilds were haunted by beasts. From the very early days of civilization, humans had settled only behind the protection of wood, brick, and rock. The many buildings outside the walls told the story of a different age. What had once been dark forests and sinister swamps was now civilized farmland, rectified and utilized by a society that had wrested control of the world from the heinous creatures that had once inhabited it. It was sad in a way. Herval had always been fascinated by the Vaurysiers, the dreaded wolfmen that, at one point in the ancient past, had kept humans in pens, not the other way around. They were the source of all his people's myths and legends, a dark contrast to Epurnae civilization. They were stronger, faster, and stealthier than humans, adept trackers with sharp senses that lived only for the hunt. Even in terms of intellect, they were equal to the peasantry. But the one thing they had never managed was to build a civilization. It was the singular advantage humans had over the beasts that hunted them, and they'd mastered it to such an extent that they had almost driven the Vaurysiers to extinction. They still existed in the far reaches, away from human settlements. Sometimes a trade caravan was assaulted, very occasionally a village raided. The last time the noble house of Simari had to dispatch with a band of Vaurysiers, his beloved father had still been a boy. "My master, the knife." Olivar was holding the ceremonial weapon in his paw. His fur was muddy brown, with streaks of white along his short snout. His drooping eyes were the color of wet wood, and his teeth were covered in a layer of disgusting spittle. Herval did not even look him in the eye as he took the ceremonial knife and removed the silver blade from its ornate sheath. He detested all Vaurysier Khan, but was expected to surround himself with them. All lesser tasks were performed by the dogfolk, and the more of them a person owned, the greater their status. As the Comte, Herval owned well over 100, but he kept them away from himself wherever he could. The only reason he let Olivar follow him around was because his father had told him to always have a Vaurysier Khan as his cupbearer. He pulled the dogman's arm over a bowl set in front of his father's grave. Olivar suppressed a wince. His pain gave Herval a certain degree of satisfaction. In many ways he respected the true Vaurysiers, those still prowling the wilds, more than the ones living in Epurnae civilization. They were paying off the debt of their mutual ancestors, serving their rightful human masters, while the wild ones still roamed free. Herval cut once, rapidly, and squeezed. Olivar's blood flowed into the cup, drop for drop, until the bottom third was filled. It was a time-honored tradition, performed by his father for his grandfather for his great-grandfather, up to the son of Harold Simari, the founder of their noble bloodline. He was a hero of the Great Liberation, known for killing Shadow Ripper, the alpha of a particularly vicious pack of Vaurysiers. On his deathbed he had revealed that it was only slave blood sacrificed by his descendants that had given him the strength to take down the beast. "Go bandage yourself," Herval commanded when he dropped Olivar's arm.
"Right away, my master."
The dogman nodded, panting, and scurried away. Erval was happy to be rid of him, if only for a moment. He watched as Olivar's blood was absorbed by the porous stone, travelling back in time to allow Harold to lose more blood than any man ever had. One day, when there was a statue of him next to this one, his son would perform the same ritual 12 times. Erval hoped that he would be as good a father to Renaud as his had been to him. When Erval left the necropolis, Girard Conner Nercimari was waiting by the doorway back into the castle. The young man was wearing an indigo doublet decorated with golden lacework. His cap was slightly off-center, as was the fashion these days, and his short sword was almost as bedecked in jewelry as the ceremonial knife. He bowed when he saw Erval. "Your Highness, the letter has been delivered for you," he informed, holding out the envelope. His manners were impeccable as always. "Since this was not given to the seneschal to read, I gather it is not administrative business," Erval said. "It would seem that way, Your Highness. It was addressed to you explicitly, and it bears the seal of the Deravan Bank of Trustees." "I don't recall ever doing business with anyone from Deravan." The name alone filled him with putrid revulsion. Deravan was the laughingstock of Epurne, having lost so much of their own culture to other worlds that they no longer considered Vorizier Khan property. "Read it to me," Erval commanded. There was a flash of surprise on Girard's face, followed by an even briefer flash of pride. To be entrusted with the Comte's correspondence was both a great honor and a test of his loyalty. Given time, Erval could see the young man becoming anything from seneschal to captain of his personal guard. "Humbly addressed to Your Highness the Comte Erval Simari of Crevaille. It is our regrettable duty to inform you of the passing of the Honourable Chamon Ner Chaumont. As the sole executors of his last will and testament, we are charged with realizing the bequest of his entire liquidated fortune upon you. We are contractually obliged to inform you that you must personally solicit our office in Deravan in order to receive the Honourable's bequest. We have been instructed to clarify that the Honourable believed that his fortune should rightfully pass on to your family, as your original investment was what allowed him to acquire his wealth to begin with. Humbly at your service, Colette Arignaud Ner Rumillet, Clerk, Deravan Bank of Trustees." Erval gritted his teeth. He wanted to scream, punch something, spit in a dogman's face for this insolence. How dare he, after all these years, humiliate Erval like this? Girard must have noticed his rage, but did his best to not let it show. "What is to be done with this, Your Highness?" "I will have to go to Deravan to collect whatever scraps Chamon was living off when he died his wretched death." Girard frowned. "Are you certain? Deravan is a week's journey away. Do you believe this inheritance is worth it?" There wasn't a word about how the person who was calling him to Deravan was a Vorizier Khan. "When Chamon ran away, he stole several pieces of jewelry from my mother. Whatever is left of that, it is my duty to retake what was stolen from my family. I could send an emissary, but with Deravan being what it is, they might send him back and demand we follow the testament to the letter. I want this to be taken care of as swiftly as possible." "As you wish, Your Highness. Should I put together a travelling party?" Erval shook his head. "It'll just be you and me. We will take Olivar. The journey will be faster that way." He could see that Girard wanted to object, but didn't. He knew that his Comte had made up his mind, and counselling him otherwise would be fruitless. Another excellent quality to have in a servant. "It shall be done, Your Highness." Erval listened for footsteps, but could only hear the whirring of the glowflies as they trailed colourful paths of light through the maze of the deep silos. Dispensers labelled with words he could not yet read lined the walls. Many of them were even older than Papa. He knew Chamon could move very quietly if he wanted to, but Erval was confident that, if he paid attention, he wouldn't be found. His tummy tingling with excitement, he unwrapped the cherry tart he'd nicked from the kitchens when old man Arbor was not looking. He wasn't supposed to have any before dinner, and even after dinner he was only allowed 1, 2 if he had been good that day. It was easier to just take one early, then behave for the rest of the day. It made for a total of 3. Erval could count a lot higher than that, but he couldn't count as high as the number of cherry tarts Old Man Arbor had prepared for the feast tonight. He took a big bite. The dough was nice and crusty, the cherries sweet and a little sour. Before he knew it, the tart was gone, and Erval cursed himself for having taken only one. Why had he thought he wouldn't want more than that? He snuck back the way he came, making for a small fountain to wash his hands in. Chamon would know he had taken a cherry tart if he didn't make the red stains on his fingers disappear. Licking them away was not enough, because Chamon would still be able to smell them. Erval wanted to be good at smelling as Chamon was. The fountain was just by the door to the winter stores. Papa had explained that they only stored things there for a few months a year so people could eat in the winter. Every year some of the food would go bad because they had so plenty. Erval did not understand why they didn't just move it to the deep silos so it could be stored forever. The Vorisier face on the fountain opened its glowing eyes as Erval approached. He touched the tip of its snout, and a stream of water started flowing from its mouth into the wash basin below. Erval wondered where the water would go after his hands were clean, and if Chamon would be able to tell by looking at wherever the water was stored that he had stolen the cherry tart. A red glowfly landed on the eye of the fountainhead. It blinked, and the bug flew away, only to settle on the other eye, which also blinked to drive it away, making it settle back on the other eye. This happened several times, and it made Erval laugh. What a stupid glowfly. When he got bored, Erval ran into the nearest terrace yard to chase squirrels. Chamon was standing there, waiting for him. He was very tall, even taller than Papa and all of his guards, and had golden white fur with brown spots. Erval checked his hands one last time to really make sure nothing was left, then grinned at Chamon as though he had nothing to hide. "Look who's been eating cherry tarts again, young master," the Vorisier Khan said. Erval froze. "Not me," he said. How could Chamon know? "You may have washed your hands, but there's still a red rim almost as wide as your cheeks, young master." Chamon sounded amused instead of angry. Erval checked the corners of his mouth. They were indeed sticky. His fingertips were suddenly deep red. Of course. What a stupid thing to forget. "Come on, young master, let's get you cleaned up." Chamon grabbed Erval by the hand and led him back inside. "Are you going to punish me?" Even if Chamon did not sound angry, he had to be. Adults were just like that. "Not this time. I might be a bit jealous. You know I can't eat cherry tarts. They must be very good if you're willing to go to such lengths to get your hands on one of them." It was very sad that Chamon could not eat any desserts. Erval forgot it very often. "But you will only get one cherry tart after dinner tonight, and only if you behave. In the meantime, after you're cleaned up, we will head down to the kitchens and ask Old Man Arbor to teach you how to make cherry tarts. That way you won't have to steal them anymore." Erval didn't know what to say. He hadn't even thought of that. If he could make his own cherry tarts, he could have as many of them as he wanted. The carriage was drawn by 4 powerful horses, and not quite as ostentatious as the one Erval would usually travel in. With little ornamentation carved in its ebony wood and the cladding fabric kept in simple dark blue, it looked more like something owned by a well-off merchant than the Comte of Crevaille. It wasn't that Erval was afraid of bandits. He wanted the journey to remain clandestine. Officially, he was in his chambers for personal reasons, and all courtly matters had been deferred to the seneschal for the time being. "Your Highness, if I may, I do believe that I recall the name Chamon from my father's records." Girard was not merely striking up a conversation. He was curious, and wanted to see how far Erval would trust him with personal matters. The Canner family had been the prime breeders of Vorisier Khan in Crevaille for generations, and deeply interwoven with the Simari court. "I assume they contradict the legal records?" Erval said, allowing Girard to speak his mind. "If I recall correctly, he comes from a line bred for intellect and loyalty." This was not some fuzzy childhood memory of playing in the family archives. Girard must have checked, out of curiosity if nothing else. "I wouldn't consider an individual failure a failure on your family's work as a whole, Girard." "I appreciate it, Your Highness, but that was not what I meant to say. His offspring was used for further breathing even after he ran away." Suddenly there was a pit in Erval's stomach. How dare they, after what that dog had done, continue to sell him as an exemplar of loyalty? He was so focused on suppressing his anger that he almost missed the fact that Girard had just placed his loyalty to his comte over the loyalty to his family. Did the offspring meet expectations? Indeed it did, Your Highness. Carit, descended of Chamon's daughter Elaine, died of spore infection because he saved his master from the fungal gardens deep underneath the castle. Erval waved the words away. The capriciousness of nature, then.
My masters, we are about to arrive at the Seregnai stables,
Olivar said through the brass speaking tube. Get us new horses. Ensure we have enough firebrand potion for Olivar, Erval commanded. Certainly, Your Highness. He should be able to ride through the night with his current dose, but around noon the exertion will become toxic. I don't care about that. Of course not, but his competency might become compromised, and quite severely so. I recommend we allow him a few hours' rest with a dose of blood clearers. I shall take the reins in the meantime, Girard offered. Erval nodded. His deep rage and disappointment over Chamon's betrayal was clouding his judgment. He couldn't let that happen. The shadow hands were pressing Erval into his bed. The room was brightly lit by the full moon, yet they had come, as they so often did, in the middle of the night. He could not move his arms and legs, and all that came out when he tried to scream for help was a pathetic wince so quiet he could barely hear it himself. The face materialized, eyes gleaming red, fangs shining like silver, and blood dripping from its flews. Erval felt the beast's cold breath on his face, heart pumping as Shadow Ripper's ghost began draining away his soul. Jaws snapped shut around his head. He jumped off the bed, a scream still stuck in his throat. The floor tiles were cool against the warm summer air pushing in through the open window, in a way it hadn't just moments before. Shadow Ripper was gone, but Erval knew he'd return the moment he crawled back under the sheets. Erval snuck out of his room through a small shaft next to his dresser, wearing only his breeches and an undershirt. Inard was watching his door, and if the guardsman caught him, he would force him to go back to bed, where Shadow Ripper was. He needed the sleep tea the physician had prescribed, the one Papa wouldn't let him have. All young men in our family must defeat Shadow Ripper, he'd explained with a sad face. Erval did not want to. He was too scared. Quietly he pushed himself into the corridor, then went downstairs, evading the few guards patrolling the castle at this hour of the night. Down below, near the foundations, the air was filled with the comforting smell of dog. Vorizier Khan snored loudly, at least most of them did. Erval liked the sound. It was one of the many things where he wished humans were more like them. Here in the castle, all Vorizier Khan had their own rooms, some even quarters, like Chaumont. Down in the village, he knew, most had to sleep outside. In winter, the lucky ones had a shelter. It was one of the things he'd change when he became Comte, much like he wouldn't have his sons suffer Shadow Ripper's haunting. Much like he knew how to get out of his room without using the door, Erval could get into Chaumond's quarters through a secret panel in the tiny kitchen. In the dim light, he could see an open bottle of wine on the counter, smell the sharp stench of alcohol. It was a rare privilege, but Chaumond was an important person. Erval stopped when he heard something. A rhythmic rumbling, a grunt here and there. It was coming from the bedroom. He approached the door carefully. It was ever so slightly open. The lamplight inside was weak, but he could see Chaumond on the bed with another Vorizier Khan, hugging her from behind. Neither were wearing any clothes, and her dark fur made her almost invisible. The way they were moving was yet another strange thing about the hugging. Whatever they were doing, Erval did not want to disturb them. He slid back into the kitchen, sitting in the corner, feeling safe because he was in Chaumond's quarters. Shadow Ripper could not get him here. The creaking of the bed stopped. There was whispering, then someone moving toward the kitchen. Chaumond peeked in through the doorway, wearing a nightgown. He was almost carefully hiding his lower body. "Erval? What are you doing here?"
"Shadow Ripper came again. He tried to eat my soul."
"I smell you on the bedroom door. What did you see?" It was unusual for him to ignore something, Erval said. You were hugging that other Vorizier Khan. For some reason, Shimon looked afraid.
Listen, young master, I will make you the sleep tea, but you have to promise me something.
Yes, I won't tell father that you made some for me. You always make me promise that, Erval said. Shimon nodded.
And you must promise not to tell anyone, about what you saw in my bedroom tonight.
Why? For a moment, Shimon seemed to think.
Because it is not allowed. I did something that isn't allowed.
Erval nodded, serious. It was strange that a grown-up would do something that wasn't allowed, but Shimon let him get away with it all the time, so he owed him for that.
Promise me, young master,
Shimon insisted. I promise, Erval said. As degenerate as it was, Deravan was a sight to behold. Its citadel, built of grey bedrock and white marble, was larger than Krovaya Castle by an order of magnitude. Giant edifices sprawled around it like ferns emerging from the roots of a mighty tree. The Iron Mountains to the east, and the Sea of Thousand Islands to the west, the city was located in an optimal position for both defense and trade. 5 arches stood upon the water, rift gates to 5 different worlds, and a fountain of immense wealth. 3 dozen ring walls, irregular and often torn away, turned Deravan into a maze. Legend has it there are entire halls in the catacombs of the castle tiled with the bones of Vorizier killed during the Great Liberation, Your Highness. The hero Liravilleux used to hold grand feasts down there where he would torture the vicious creatures with his guests back then. He was one of the very first breeders of Vorizier Khan. Girard spoke of him with almost religious reverence. Liravilleux was one of the most well-known heroes of the Great Liberation, progenitor of the Rumillet line that still ruled the city. Erval had always found his story less noble than that of Arrosy-Marie. He was as much a sadist as he was a liberator, even if his torments had been directed against those who deserved them. Maybe it was guilt that had driven the Rumillet dynasty to abolish the social order that had proven itself for thousands of years. Deravan smelled of dog. Just outside the fortified roads, patrolled by armed guards, the outskirts of the city were an endless field of huts clustered together, inhabited almost exclusively by Vorizier Khan living in their own filth. Erval saw a pack of them leer over his modest carriage, struggling not to follow their wild instincts in the presence of the law. Of all dogfolk, these had to be the most pathetic. Rejected by their inborn purpose to serve humanity in pursuit of empty freedom, yet unfree to be the beasts they all were on the inside, having to pretend a civilization they were incapable of maintaining. Erval almost felt sorry for them. Inside the first ring wall, things became much more civilized. There was still Vorizier Khan, but mostly serving humans, or at least directed by them. Deravan had not dared to abolish the very concept of ownership itself. These Vorizier Khan had protections against the kinds of things no respectable person would ever do. It was an unfortunate formality, but Erval found it objectionable only in principle. The disgusting thing were the free Vorizier Khan, which most of them were, seen as equal citizens to the humans. It was perverse. The Deravan Bank of Trustees was not difficult to find. It was a great white tower, almost as tall as Krovaya Castle, dominating the skyline of a market district near the port. A group of stout men with brutish features was just coming out of its dark doorway, conversing angrily in a harsh tongue. Though their clothes looked expensive, they lacked sleeves, putting their heavily inked arms on display. Much stranger than the off-worlders was the Vorizier Khan dressed in finery coming out after them, followed by a retinue of humans and dogfolk in considerably less ostentatious clothing. Of course, there had to be exceptions. Humans had bred Vorizier Khan for desirable traits long enough for there to be a handful of capable of being civilized. Still, Erval was bothered by it. Erval put his sigil ring on display as he stepped out of the carriage, Girard following behind. Both guards at the door, one human, one Vorizier Khan, bowed. In the cavernous white reception hall, conversation ceased, and polite nods as well as deferential genuflections were directed at him. It was good to know that at least they respected nobility in this morally decayed establishment. A young receptionist approached him, her servile smile almost genuine.
Your Highness, may I assume you are Comte Herval Simari of Crovaille?
You may. I'd prefer if we disposed of ceremony and dedicated ourselves to the business at hand. This is my retainer, Girard Conner ner Simari. Consider him an extension of my will in all regards.
Of course, Your Highness. I shall send a message to the Honourable Lourdes ner Lourdes immediately.
Who? The receptionist seemed confused.
The Honourable Chamon ner Chamon's business partner. I have been instructed to summon her. Apologies if you had not been informed of this. What about the carriage you arrived in?
Herval will take care of it, said Herval. He did not like this sudden new development. Another Vorisier Khan sitting at the table, pretending to be his equal.
Certainly, Your Highness. If you'd please follow me.
The attending clerk was the same one that had penned the letter. Her office was half as small as Herval's winter study, and lined wall to wall with dark bookshelves packed full of volumes upon volumes of records. A single window was the only source of daylight. Most of the illumination was provided by glowing vines suspended in a fine mesh net above them. Herval had never seen anything like it. All offices are lit by Miklu moon roots now. Personally, I find it a bit filthy to have plants inside buildings, but I am not management. Colette Arigneux ner Rumillet explained. She was the same age as his mother would have been right about now. Your Highness, I am truly happy that you followed this invitation, and I am so sorry for the inconvenience. The Honourable Chamon was always a bit of an eccentric, in the best of ways, but as his sole beneficiary, you must know this better than anyone. You knew him well, then? Herval asked. He was curious how, after all these years, Chamon could be described by anyone as eccentric. Colette seemed confused by the question. Of course. He was one of my most important clients, and one of my favourites. You must not be very important, then. Herval regretted the insult immediately. It was childish of him to behave this way. Your Highness, I must insist that you know I am one of the most senior clerks here. The clients I handle are important to the whole bank as an institution. Are you aware of how much wealth we have been managing for the Honourable? I'm getting the feeling it was more than just the jewels he stole from my dear departed mother. The Honourable Chamon ner Chamon was several times considered by the Board of Trustees to join their ranks. He refused every time, wishing to focus on his business instead. And what was his business? Well, off-world chipping, of course. The way the wind was rustling through the barley field sounded almost like rain. The afternoon sun felt good on Herval's skin, but he would have liked to see a rainbow nonetheless. Vorisier Khan with giant baskets on their backs were bringing in the harvest. As your Highness can see, stars will be overflowing this year, Seneschal Gernot said to Papa in the open carriage. The fat man was prone to sweeping gesticulation. As bountiful as last year? Papa asked. More so, in fact. And the barley trade has become even more profitable this year. Shipping through Derivan would mean off-world buys on both Dimirov and Zoath. The treasurer will be happy to hear it, Papa said. Don't get him too excited, though. Half our overflow should be brought to Lizère. Their harvest has been cut short by the grain pox, and they are in for a harsh winter. Herval was bored. Papa had ordered him to come with so he could learn about agriculture. But what he'd hoped would become explanations on how plants grew in fields and how to cut them properly was yet another lesson in economics and gift-giving. Look after yourself first, but never so much that you stop being kind to your neighbours. If you are kind to your neighbours, they will be kind to you, was a sentence he'd understood even without being shown examples all the time. No doubt Chamon would ask him about this during his next tutoring session. He wished Chamon was here. It would have been more fun that way. Aside from the carter, the only other Vorisier Khan with them was Malif, Papa's personal manservant, who was looking at the field workers with derision in his eyes that Herval didn't quite understand. They had it worse than him. He was in no place to hate them. Ignoring the conversation between Papa and the Seneschal, Herval followed Malif's gaze as they turned a gentle bend to circle back around to the castle. He knew he'd seen something important before he recognized what it was. She was dressed in a heavier, looser garment than the other field workers, but with the green eyes and dark fur it was obvious. She was the woman Chamon had been hugging 2 months ago. Erval had forgotten about the incident entirely, and it occurred to him that this was a great way to keep it secret. Maybe he could forget it again. He met the Vorizier Khan's gaze and she froze. There was fear in her eyes. Erval did not know what to do. He wanted to tell her not to be afraid, that he would not betray Chamont's trust, but doing so would, of course, alert father and the seneschal. He simply looked away instead, staring at a lone tree in the middle of the field instead. "Are you listening, Erval?" Papa asked. He looked up, unwilling to admit that he hadn't, saying nothing. "If you want, I can have one of the workers show you how to use a sickle. Would you like that?" Lourdes Nerlourdes did not dress ostentatiously, but the quality of her fabrics was obvious. She had mud-browned fur spotted so subtly with a lighter shade that they were difficult to make out. Her eyes were different from each other, as was the case with many Vorizier Khan. One dark gold, one green. They were filled with pure hatred. "Honorable Lourdes Nerlourdes, these are His Highness the Comte Erval Simari and Girard Conner Ner-Simari," Colette the clerk said. Erval was not sure if the look she gave Girard was even worse than the one she gave him. "Right, Your Highness. I've heard things about you. Let's get this over with." The way she addressed him made Erval's skin crawl. She was not human. She had no right to call him Your Highness. "It just so happens I have not heard any things about you," he said. "You mean you didn't keep in touch with your childhood slave?" Lourdes Nerlourdes sat down opposite him, arms crossed. Colette retreated behind her desk, clearly uncomfortable but professional enough not to let it show. Considering where she worked, situations like these might be common for her. "Why are you here?" Erval asked. "I'm here because the man I respect most in the world, a man who has died, asked me to be. I'm here because he wants me to bestow his fortune upon you for whatever reason. He stole from me, from my mother. His guilt got to him, but only after death. Nothing he could have taken would have been compensation enough for a lifetime of slavery. The moment he removed his own collar, he became able to reach his true potential." Lourdes' jaw was trembling. There were tears in her eyes. "You'll have to sign this." Colette pushed a document over to the Vorizier Khan. Lourdes picked up a fountain pen and scribbled a signature without even looking at it, then tried handing it to Erval. When Girard attempted to grab it, she pulled it back and growled at him. "I'm not touching anything that touches you," she snarled. "You'll certainly not give it to His Highness. It is beneath a comte to handle his own paperwork, but being the savage creature you are, I will forgive this offense against my liege. 7 years I haven't stepped foot on this fucking world, and now I have to talk to the man who killed my mother." For a moment, Erval thought Lourdes would leap to attack Girard. He recognized her then and there. "I've never killed any Vorizier Khan, sadly." Girard's voice was pure poison. "But your father did. Isn't that how this works? You pay for the sin of your ancestors? If you can justify enslaving my people with it, I can justify hating you for it personally." "You're Chamont's daughter," said Erval. He hadn't even known about her existence, but in hindsight it seemed obvious. He also hadn't known that her mother had been euthanized, but it did not come as a surprise. He rose. "Pay me for the value of the stolen jewelry. I want no part in the rest of it." Lourdes frowned. "That's not what my father wanted." "I don't care." He looked over at Colette. "Can you draw up the paperwork?" After a moment, the clerk nodded. "Of course, Your Highness." Erval hit Litian's paw with the atlas. His new tutor winced, but forced herself to smile. Her fangs were eroded to the point of almost being teeth.
"Young master, geography is a very important subject to learn for a future comte."
"I want Chamont to teach it," Erval demanded.
"Unfortunately, young master, Chamont is no longer able to do so."
"Yes, because he ran away, but I don't believe that. He would never steal from my mother. I would hate him if he did that." Erval slammed the book down again. He knew father would punish him for it, but he didn't care. "Chamont would never do something to make me hate him. He's my best friend in the whole wide world." Litian nodded, forcing herself not to grimace.
"Of course, young master, but His Highness wants me to teach you right now, and I serve him more than I serve you. I hate you, stupid bitch!
Herval threw the atlas away, then spat at Litian. He aimed for her face, but only hit her shoulder. It only made him angrier. With heavy heat rising from his belly, he stormed out the door. I can instruct my father to have Chamon's descendant neutered, Your Highness, even euthanized if you so desire. Herval could hear the indignation in Girard's suggestion. He hadn't said a word for the entire ride back to Crevaille so far. Let them live, Herval responded, staring out the window at the passing mountains. Are you certain, Your Highness? They are a pollution upon the line. We want loyal Virizier-Khan after all. Chamon left out of loyalty. It was simply loyalty for his blood, not loyalty for his owner. Your father saw this. Girard said nothing. He would need a while to be himself again. No man should have to bear such insults from a dog. Have one or two brought up as cupbearers, Herval said. Your Highness? Girard did not understand. Just do as I said. Herval did not have to justify himself to anyone.
If you liked this story and would like to hear more, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. A new short story is uploaded every Wednesday, and there will occasionally be another one in between if I find the time. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day.